Welcome to No Question About That. This is United Inc., our finance show with Jamie, also known as Subprime Goals on socials. How's it going?
Yeah, good, Ed. Important week ahead, as well as it also being a poignant week for Manchester United in terms of the anniversary.
What a wonderful anniversary to celebrate. And we're not celebrating 80 years of VE Day, it's 20 years of the Glazers. Deary me, I almost can't believe it's been this long. This long of in finance terms, since this is a finance show, basically financial mismanagement of the family and financial disinformation out there in the Twitter sphere or the blogosphere and Reddit and forums before that, and it still hasn't got any better. Even yesterday, I was like having a tweet at one of the aggregator accounts, going, "What the fuck are you guys talking about?" Because it just doesn't seem to have seeped in. But we'll go through all the kind of the financial aspect of the Glazer takeover, what it has meant in terms of the good stuff, massive increase in revenue and EBITDA, well, sort of, and the bad stuff, piles and piles of debt, massive amounts of debt interest, some repayments, actually not that much, and a kind of difficult looking future with bonds maturing in the next couple of years. I'll have to be refinanced in a very different financial environment. So let's roll it all the way back. How old were you when the takeover happened? You were about 3 years old, weren't you, you youngster?
in finance literacy terms, probably. But yeah, I would have been about 15 at the time. And, as I was growing up, I heard about the Sky takeover. That wasn't kind of long. Or the prospective Sky takeover. That wasn't long after I kind of first started supporting United and going to games. But yeah, 2005, I probably wasn't old enough to really understand the full implications of, I think, one, what was happening at the time, and two, all of the ramifications from that. And as my financial literacy improved, I think it became awfully clear just what has happened and what it's meant for brand Manchester United.
Well, yeah, and it's been incredibly toxic, and it took the media. The conversation I had with Dan on yesterday's extra show, patreon.com/NQAT pod if you want to get our extra shows. Sorry to plug. we talked about the media sort of literacy, or the media's role in very poorly explaining both the nature of the takeover, although of course fan groups were pushing very hard with limited actual power to stop anything. But the nature of the takeover, the dangerous position United were in for a few years, and I don't think it's hyperbole to say it was extremely dangerous, the nature of the leverage buyout and the risks that were taken on the business model, as David Gill, former Manchester United CEO, pointed out in the takeover process, and then turncoated and decided it was all okay after all when they offered him a large contract. I mean, maybe the two things aren't linked. But the media's role in very poorly explaining, and it's only slightly better now. I did notice The Athletic did a whole series this week, both on financials and fan culture and other stuff around it. And that's the kind of depth of reporting that I kind of expected over these years. And it shouldn't have been up to fans to go, hang on a minute, this is actually what's going on. But I mean, pioneers like Andy Green, who you may know through the finance world, but Anders Red, doing some work at Must at the moment. And his blog kind of really brought financial literacy to the fore in terms of fandom. And, it was very important in explaining both what had happened with the payment in kind loans and the initial leverage to the bond issue in 2010, the initial bond issue, obviously being refinanced since then, and then the IPO in 2012 and what that kind of had meant for the club overall.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned those Athletic articles. I wholeheartedly agree. I think they're fantastic bits of journalism. And I think also there's the Talk of the Devils podcast that I was actually listening to earlier on today. And I think first of a 2-part series on the takeover. And some of the people who were either involved or very close to it at the time, one comment that chimed with me was Lord Jim O'Neill, an extremely well-respected economist and financier associated with the Red Knights takeover. He said that the board at the time obviously did put lots of warning signs out there and did, signpost this extremely well. And I think, agreed with the fans on all of the risks. And I think even he was saying that, what the Glazers did whilst financially was a great deal, removing emotion from the situation. It was probably right on the extreme of what a football regulator would and should be considering as it relates to football ownership, going forward.
Yeah. I listened to that as well, and obviously Sir Jim O'Neill has been involved in the club in some aspects for 25 years or so. Either through being a supporter or prospectively being a buyer. Didn't materialise or was on the board for a while as a non-exec, and very well respected as someone who did an economics undergrad. I guess he was someone I never really went into finance properly, but very, very well respected figure at Goldman Sachs and other places. So, absolutely. I don't know whether a football regulator would block this kind of stuff. Certainly under the monopolies and mergers, under the kind of general UK law, there was no prospective path to block this. It was just a takeover. It's like very, very common. And in fact, one of the arguments now made with the football regulator proposal bill white paper as it is, it looks like it's going through, is it won't block that kind of leverage, or it's looking at like controls around the amount of leverage, but ... quite a number of Premier League clubs are private equity backed or owned. Like, what's the difference? I know you can say one is debt and one is equity, but it's all someone else's money, right? So, like structurally, it may look slightly different, but I don't know it's actually that different, right? And in fact, so I suppose the debt part of the Manchester United takeover was easier to execute, right? So if you look over the 20 years of United ownership, the returns, or at least the compound growth rate in top line revenue is only about 8%, right? The returns on invested capital are a bit better because Sir Jim Ratcliffe has come along and paid way over the odds for an asset that if it was not a football club would not have been valued that way, right? So private equity terms, it would have been a very bad deal. In debt terms, it was great for the banks. I mean, it's been perfect, right? They've been paid £1 billion worth of interest over the last 20 years, and they've still got another 500 and something million outstanding.
And I do think, I mean, look, we can get onto it in terms of the future structure and etc. But I think on just this leverage point, the Premier League do have a clause in there which I think would limit the extent of the leverage that can be put on a club now. I can't remember the exact ratio, but it would stop the type of deals that the Glazers did with United. So there's some protection, but it isn't completely outlawed. And I think my overall view is like I'm not adverse to debt, but I think it's the context in which it's done. And I think the area, or the thing that I think promotes so much ire, is because United have been so badly run post Ferguson, that's exacerbated any issues, and I think brought closer the risks that come from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, why don't we go through the sort of time series of what happened? So it's a £790 million buyout. I think less than 200 million of that, $790 million, I think. Yeah. Less than 200 million of that was the actual Glazers' own money. I mean, Malcolm had made money out of these low rent strip malls. He had a fish canning business at one point. He bought the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the NFL basically allows owners to take money out. The interesting, we mentioned The Athletic, they have a piece on how they are viewed in Tampa Bay, and they've won a couple of Super Bowls, so it's not entirely negative over there. Financial controls are much stricter in the NFL, though, and I think that's part of it. And so we had this leverage buyout, massive amount of high interest loan rates, interest rate, like the actual gross interest paid in those first few years. You look at it, it's like over £100 million a year. I mean, it's like absolute bonkers. So when people like Andy Green were talking about the risks. Those were the risks, because what was in the Glazers' control, broadcast wasn't really in their control. Like they're one of 20. Commercial was, and you can say for a good 10 years they did a good work on that. It's flatlined. And matchday was under their control, and they stuck 80% ticket price rises in the first 3 or 4 years. Not popular, I remember at the time, but I guess they fairly correctly assumed that they were leaving a lot of money on the table with United's fan base. So cold-hearted business and all of that. But like they're right on the edge of that. If the broadcast revenue hadn't really spiked, it's risen 500% in the time that they have been at the club, United to be in a desperately difficult position.
Totally. And I think, kind of digging into that detail a little bit further, the broadcast revenue, as you say, it's gone from 50 million to just a shade under 225 million during their reign. But the context behind that is key. I think United in the Premier League prize money table in 2005 got about 40 million pounds. Now, for finishing, whether it's 16th or 17th, they'll get about 135 million. So nearly 4x. Now, United are a part of that, but they're not the sole driver. When you think about match day, I think, as you say, there were ticket price rises that have gone up, but I actually think it's not really that much, Glazer input on those sorts of decisions. After those initial price rises, they've been kept very flat. We all know that there's not been that investment in the stadium. So really, has there been that much monetization of the stadium? Not really. And I actually think that is another area or another reason why I think Sir Jim Ratcliffe, does want this new stadium, because actually, you go around Manchester on a match day. I know there's a lot of chat about, how most of Manchester actually supports City. You really don't feel it. And
it's never been true. It's just
and literally walking around Manchester on a match day, you do see the reality of the situation. Now, I think the commercial side of things, and this has been talked about by David Gill and others, is they did have an impact here. So the revenue there has gone from about 45 million all the way up to 300 million. However, wrote something this week. That's flatlined for the past 7 years. And they're now being overtaken by, the likes of Liverpool, who have done that organically and have done a very, very good job at it. And so I do think, when you think about what are the benefits that the Glazer ownership has brought, I think, look, there's clearly been some, but does that excuse everything else that's happened? I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
It's facilitated. I think it's facilitated them to be able to kind of go after this strategy of spending lots of money on players.
Yeah.
But
well,
really,
yes, I think that's the right way of framing it, right? So if we talk about what they did commercially, they broke things down by region and by sector, and this was a brand new strategy for United. So prior to that, we were only looking at blue chips, basically, and kind of global blue chips. And then they segmented it, and they were able to extract more money as a result. The thing is that kind of global sponsorship market increased across all sports, right? So the globalization was not the Glazers driving. Now, they were early in football terms, I think. So there's the kind of tick in the plus column. Yeah, Edward Wood understood how to do this, and his team for the Glazers, and the Glazers brought over some NFL now, I guess. Everyone else copied it. So the relative advantage for United was not, it didn't last very long, right? And in fact, it was a model that was out there to be seen and taken for anyone who's smart enough to do it. So there's, and prior to that, United's commercialization was it was kind of physical, right? It was the mega store. It was Peter Kenyon's sort of view of, we're going to sell you stuff. And in the 90s, those stores were full. We had the crappy one. They're still there, actually, the sort of temporary building at the side of Old Trafford, and then eventually they built one in Old Trafford in the East Stand.
Yeah.
But but it hadn't been globalized in the way they thought about it, and it was, and that's to their benefit. Or the Glazers credit that they sort of did that, but it was overtaken very, very quickly. I mean, one of the challenging things looking at commercial revenue is there's no standard, right? So you look at Paris Saint-Germain, all the sponsors begin with a Q. Yeah, City, we know exactly what they've done there. Bayern Munich include like exec boxes in their commercial income, so it looks bigger than it really is. I think that's really matchday income, and so on and so on and so on. So there's no real baseline, but United are among the leading ones. But you could say now that commercial income is basically a media property, right? It's a factor of your global reach and how much you can channel a brand's message to your billion fans, if you believe that, right? So you could say that United are still under commercialized, right? Being such an incredible, like the link between the amount people talk about United, think about United, watch United, associate with United, all the media coverage and the commercial revenue. I feel like if you look at other media businesses, that United aren't big enough, right? And that may well be part of Sir Jim's thinking. Like, how do you do more brand tie-ups, and what do they look like?
Exactly. And I think, this point about what is the baseline, it was one of the reasons why I didn't include the likes of a PSG or a City. Like in my analysis, like Liverpool, probably the most organic comparison. And actually, looking through their global partnerships list, it's actually a little bit envious, right? Like you compare the names versus United. A lot of the names that United have on their global partner list are not household names. You look at Liverpool's, they've got the Expedias, EA Sports, Google Pixel, Coca-Cola. There are some pretty big brands there that are putting their weight behind behind Liverpool. United still don't have that. And so I do think, I think Mark Armstrong could end up being an incredibly savvy.
Yeah. And he did an amazing job at Paris Saint-Germain, like branding this as a global Paris associated brand, and with all and the Nike partnerships and Nike, I should say. Now I'm in America, we have to call it that. Yeah. I'm only about 200 miles from Nike HQ. Nike
and Jordan.
Yeah, and the Jordan brand, and it'll be. I mean, obviously we're tied into Adidas for another 9 years or something like that. But look for those different types of partnerships going forward. I'm sure. I mean, in terms of like digitization of United's brand, I think there's scope there as well. I mean, MUTV is a kind of side thing. It's barely break even, honestly, and the revenue associated with that is tiny. Of course, that's to do with not having the rights to the live Premier League, but I mean, think about all the media exposure they could be doing. Unfortunately, they've cut most of that team now, right? So there's no one there to improve that. Anyway, so we talked a little bit about commercial broadcasting, matchday, and how they've risen over time. Should we talk a little bit about debt repayment, management fees, and dividends? This is all the negative side of things as it comes to United.
The famous billion out and $1 billion spent.
Yeah, God. I mean, it's just over $1 billion out if you add interest payments, debt payments. Debt payments are kind of, they've only been like, I mean, in the last 10 years, like 100 and something million, right? They're not paying down the debt much. Management fees, they've stopped doing that, but for the first early few years, they were taking a fee for the pleasure of having them on our board.
Yeah. That was just about £27.4 million.
And then dividends have gone up and down over the years. They didn't take some during COVID. Then they paid themselves double just after COVID, which was nice. It settled in at this sort of 22 million a year for a while, didn't it? And now Sir Jim's come along and he said, not having that anymore.
Yeah. And I think the breakdown is roughly 800 on interest and debt, 170 dividends, and then the rest on those consultancy fees. And I think, again, just briefly touching on that kind of like, what's the return been for the Glazers? Well, with the earnout from, Sir Jim Ratcliffe buying some of their shares, it's about an 8x cash on cash return for them so far. And they're not done there, right?
Yeah, no.
If they sell more shares, it has the scope to, I don't know what the biggest and best cash on cash return private equity deal has ever been in the history of the world, but I imagine this wouldn't be that far off.
the difference between United's like revenue growth, so like I mentioned that before, is only about 8% compound, and the share price, which is, I mean, it's gone up and down a little bit, and especially you can kind of discount the takeover period because that inflated it for a while, but we're only just over the $12 IPO price, right? So the market is not saying, hey, this is a long-term bet. But for the Glazers, you're right, as a what, if you think about it in private equity terms, fantastic deal for them. Unbelievable. You couldn't have worse people getting that kind of return. And what have they done for it either? Not a lot.
Well, as you say, they've enabled, I think, a net spend of about £1.5 billion on transfers.
And that has to be split, though, because if you look at the net spend pre-Fergie's retirement, it's like 200 million or something. Post-Fergie's retirement,
it's the 1.3.
I've got the number here. It's a massive amount anyway.
Yeah. But coming back to your point on debt, look, there's obviously the credit facility out there, which is 300 million total, but there's only 90 million pounds left on that at the moment. So we've drawn down 210, and that expires in June 27. There's then another $425 million of senior secured notes, which mature in also June 27. And there's a secured term loan, which is $225 million maturing in August 2029. So, those with eagle ears, brains, mathematically minded, there is a couple of important staging posts here, right? Like that June 2027 date just so happens to be just over 3 years after Sir Jim Ratcliffe invested into Manchester United. And of course, there is that 3-year period where Sir Jim is effectively an operating partner, whilst also being the single biggest shareholder. And I think, quite rightly, the debt is often put on the Glazers' head as a serious issue for United as a business. And I do agree. However, when we think about, okay, what could refinancing look like? Actually thinking about those three portions of debt on their own, if I look at it with a financier's hat on, I actually think it's not quite as bad as it could be. When you add the stadium in, that might be the thing which kind of triggers something more drastic to happen sooner rather than later. But
the concern, though, is about the interest rate because it's quite low, right? What's the ticker on that? It's like 3.25% or something on those senior secured notes. And if you issued a new bond right now, you would not get that rate. Now, in 2 years' time, who knows where the global economy is? Let's hope Mr. Trump, President Trump, King Trump, as we should call him these days, doesn't blow up the global economy, and then interest rates can come down, right?
Well, yeah, that's the irony of the current macro situation, which is the worse it is, actually, the better it might be for United on any refinancing deal. But there is there are institutions out there that would look at this and say, well, okay, if you've now got a handle on the underlying business, the operations of it and the profitability of it, well, actually, there's a way in which we might be able to refinance this for you and, maybe take an equity stake in return for kind of, refinancing that debt and restructuring that debt in a more convenient way. And, Sir Jim Ratcliffe does have a background in private equity. And so, I think we talked about it on the last show, knowing institutions like Glazers, there are ways in which that can occur.
Yeah, some form of private structured debt rather than Goldman Sachs loan is probably more likely, right? But yeah, there are a lot of question marks over that. I mean, of course, Sir Jim, in theory, has an awful lot of equity to play with in his other businesses. He has seemingly shown no interest in reducing his overall stake in Ineos, and it wouldn't be a particularly good time to sell right now with quite a lot of warning signs around that business. But yeah, there's the markers ahead are interesting, right? 27 maturation of those loans this August, when the sort of 18-month lockout period ends, and in theory the Glazers could start chopping around for new investors at that $33 share price. That is sort of the floor at which they can drag Sir Jim along, or he could exit, but that's unlikely.
I look, I think this often doesn't get talked about, and I'm not entirely sure why, but whilst Sir Jim Ratcliffe did pay, a hefty price per share, actually the structure of the deal is also his defense, right? Like paying such a high fee for what was a distressed asset at the time, and still to a degree is. He's also come in and put a lot of quote unquote his people in place, his Ineos people in place. If you're a prospective buyer, are you going to come in, pay that $33 per share or more potentially, and have the risk of, well, the team that has just been fixing this may all just go?
Yeah.
So whilst he's had to pay, a pretty price, that might end up working to his advantage in terms of, the Glazers potentially trying to shop around. And I think also, the Glazers then, for them, it also works. They also have a price, right? And they were happy with it, back when the deal was done. Yeah, okay, they could be, they could try and get a higher price for it, but then you have all of these other dynamics that come into play.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't look, I think it's very true about the management team. Then again, if new owners come into any business, clear out of the executives is like standard practice.
Yeah.
You retain a little bit of institutional knowledge on whatever their gardening leave length of contract is, and then you fire everyone. Not uncommon. The thing that worries me, concerns me, I mean, I don't know what the best future for United is. A benevolent dictator with hundreds of billions that they just want to spend and don't really care. But they're a nice guy, not the kind that goes around murdering political distance, that kind of thing. But it would still look attractive to a nation state as a trophy asset, less so to private equity and unless there's a really clear path to the turnaround. And the challenge is in most private equity, you look at what are the assets that can be grown, what are the platforms that you have to roll out the toolkit, and this is sort of often the playbook, right? And with United, there's an awful lot you don't control, and so that's why it makes it look, football clubs look a bit risky, and you can see this with Clear Lake and Chelsea, right? How much they've spent for what return so far? It's not a lot, I'd say. So, in fact, given how much they spent on that asset, plus everything they've spent in the market and all the shenanigans they've had to do, it's a little hard to say they'd get their money back.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So we touched on transfer spending a little bit. Let's dive into that a bit more, because this is it's just incredible what has happened. Like, so Fergie, if you remember, had to talk about there being no value in the market after we sold Ronaldo and replaced him with Gabriel Obertan and Michael Owen. It was awesome. And so he had this kind of hands around the neck, tightening of everything until he retired, basically. He got that one present, which was Robin Van Persie, that bought him a title. Yeah. And Van Persie was great for 6 months. But that was worth it. 24 million. And prior to that, though, I mean, just really restricted on most years. So I think it's about 200 million or so net spend from 2005 to 2013, something like that. And then it's just massive increase. And I guess this is the Glazers. One, after the IPO, they were a bit more, the finance was more sustainable. And so the capacity to spend was there, but also Fergie had disappeared and they were trying to protect the value of everything. Got it all completely wrong, though. £1 billion net spend post-Fergie. And how much of that has been valuable? The 55 million on Bruno, and that's about it.
You can almost break this down into 3 chapters, and it's in terms of the post-Fergie era, and it's a one where it's kind of, Graham Souness in Turkey planting your flag in the middle of the pitch, saying that we know the winning formula, outstanding commercial growth, commercial revenue growth, 21% year over year. means you can, you're generating good profitability. And so in spite of the debt, you can actually spend quite a lot. However, as we all know, there wasn't really a kind of structured way of thinking from a footballing perspective as to how that was done. And I do think, as an outsider, it looks like there was also, I think, just political power struggles, right? Like every time a manager got close to kind of quote unquote cracking it, all of a sudden something got pulled from underneath them, whether that was Van Gaal, whether that was Mourinho, etc. But like that first period, and I think what Van Gaal talked about in terms of United being a commercial club. When you look at the numbers, it's actually very, very true, right? Like that was the point where commercial revenue was nearly 50% of the total. And after that point, the commercial revenue started to slow because the on-pitch performance started to slow, and you couldn't just, sign a deal with whoever you wanted. And it's also then interesting if you look at the number of staff in that department, it also started to grow. And, I've been thinking this week, it's like that famous Roy Keane saying, which is like, and not just him that said it, but no is a sentence. And I feel like there was a point in United where they weren't saying no to some of the demands of these partners. And I think it was almost in order to get more money from these partners, you needed to do more. And then that came at the, cost of what was happening on the pitch. And so, the Mourinho era, I kind of coin as, oh no, we think we got the formula right, we just didn't execute it very well. And then post Mourinho, it was like, oh, actually, no, like the fundamentals are failing us, but we just need to spend more to continually get the Champions League. And then, it's almost that thing where you're grabbing onto the edge of the cliff edge and it's falling away from you and you're just scrambling to kind of keep up with it.
Very much so. Very much so. And isn't this any business, right? It's about the resources you have and your strategic decisions around how you deploy those, right? And so in a sense, United's resources have grown over time, but their decision making around how they use those resources has been consistently terrible to the point it's damaged those resources. And it would be hard to point to a football club anywhere in the world over the last 10 years that has managed their money and their finances and their resources worse than United. Even Barcelona, who, like, it was potentially criminal in terms of how they manage their finances, have still got a winning team on the pitch. I mean, they're going to win La Liga this season. They were disappointed and shocked to leave the Champions League at the semi-final stage, from which they will make 150 million euros, right?
Yeah.
Companies were falling over themselves to hand free money to Barcelona. Now they're taking them to court because Barcelona TV wasn't worth much without any assets and all of that kind of stuff. But no other club has been as badly run as United. And from the position they're in now, you could look to a bunch of lower league clubs and Reading and Bury and Southend and so on, a whole bunch that have been sort of mismanaged, and that's really common down the leagues. But as a kind of prize asset elite club, it's been shockingly bad. And this is the distance, isn't it, between just how badly the company and the club has been managed and just how much the Glazers are taking out. And it's like the gut punch of having them as our owners and having to pay them to be our owners and how badly they've owned us. It's impossible to take.
Look, it can make you really emotional. It can make you pretty sad when you think about it. When I was growing up, the pride that you had, you've got, the United badge on your chest, and like, it kind of felt like it meant something. And, there is, I think some people have touched on this, but, going to games, sometimes there is also, there's an apathy about it now, which is the worst place to be. And for an institution, which I do think United are, I think it's a damning state of affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have to get back to the point where people are not dreading going to the stadium. And it's an exciting day out in which they spend loads of money on merch and food and entertainment. And this is, Sir Jim's vision as well as their ticket. And they support the team and they want the team to win. And it's exciting and all that kind of stuff because brands want to be associated with that. When that famous thing that Ed Woodward said on one of the earnings calls, where he said that commercial income is disassociated from what happens on the pitch. I mean, he was dead wrong, right? He was right to a certain point that there was a flaw with United's commercial income, but there's also a ceiling that was put in place by that failure. And he just didn't see it. I was on that call. I listened to that. I was like, oh, fuck.
I do think, though, to take it to slightly more positive tones, whilst I think a lot of the decisions that this current leadership team has taken over the past year or so has been criticised, and some of it, I think, rightly so. I think there's been some oversights, I think, particularly from like a what is it we stand for perspective. I think there's definitely a lot to kind of criticise, but I think also learn from. Actually, if I think about, quote unquote, the path to redemption for United, I may say something kind of that I later regret, but I don't think it's that difficult, right? Like, I was looking at the numbers earlier today, and the revenue base at the moment is about 675 million. Wages and amortization costs of 535. You've got other costs about 175. So your revenue 675, cost 710, right? Liverpool's wage structure is 480 million. So about 50 million less than us. With where we are in the league this year, and the fact that we're not in the Champions League, if you just all of a sudden become a Champions League club and get your squad structure correct, you're basically getting another 130 million in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Whilst
guaranteed.
Whilst cutting.
Yeah.
And I actually do have some faith that this team will kind of get that right, because it's one of those where if you gut things out from a playing squad perspective and you just make solid decisions, you don't even have to shoot the lights out. Get more things right than you do wrong, United will be in a much better position.
I mean, I agree in the general assessment. The execution is what will decide whether that's a good assessment or not. Right? And literally with any business, but especially in sport. And here it's getting the deals right in the summer is so bloody critical. So one is like how much they can spend PSR terms, how much cash they actually have to spend, right? So that's fairly clear. Can they do the right deals so that next season is not a bloody disaster? Because it's one thing we win the Europa League and we're back in the Champions League, we're then back out of it again. But like that yo-yo status is very hard to break, as Arsenal saw for years, and so did Liverpool actually in their wilderness years period. It's hard to break out of it. And because of the expansion in the Champions League and the expansion in revenue there and the Club World Cup, we're looking, if we're not in the Champions League or only in it one in every 2 years, or at the moment, one in every 3 years or something, you look at other teams moving away from us. So there's the negative side of your scenario. I mean, it's definitely totally right? Get in the Champions League, all of a sudden things look way rosier. The negative side of it, if we're not in there, is that Liverpool, Arsenal, Chelsea, Manchester City, even Newcastle. I mean, Newcastle are quite a bit behind us in terms of like top line revenue at the moment. They start to move away from us in terms of their ability to spend in the market, and it kind of compounds. And you have Arsenal like announcing record EBITDA at the moment, that they're extremely profitable club, extremely profitable. They're already buying Zubimendi. They could go out and spend another 100 million on Florian Wirtz or whatever. I'm not saying they will do that, but that's the negative side of that scenario, is that we don't get the decisions right. Other clubs do and are increasing their revenues and their capacity to spend in the market and have a better record on picking the right players. That it could be a long road back. But the baseline is 1 billion fans, right? Leverage the 1 billion fans. That's what they're trying to do. Leverage it well, make the right decisions, and you're in a much better position. So, but it's difficult. It's really difficult. You look at Christian Vivel, who everyone likes, thinks is a top hire, and Wilcox appears to have the faith of Barada, and you'd hope that Barada, having worked with Giristan and Florence Serrano and Pep Guardiola would have a sense of what is good here, right? So let's believe we've got the right team in place now. Go do the right deals and make sure they work. And last summer, it was so-so, wasn't it? The transfer spending wasn't a total disaster. I mean, where we're getting 90% of them wrong, which was true from 2013 to 2023.
Yeah.
I would say 90% failure rate. It's just incredible. It has to be a 10% failure rate. But last summer, I mean, not bad. Lenny Yoro looks like he's going to be an excellent acquisition. De Ligt is so-so, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Onana the year before was a disaster, but we'll close that one out. So, the 5 deals done last summer were okay.
Yeah, you had Mazraoui in there and Agate as well. And
and Agate's taken a lot of criticism his first year. We'll see. I think he has a ceiling as a player. Mazraoui's been he turned into a very good squad player, and he was cheap, right? So if you can repeat that, in fact, do better with 4 very good deals that you fund from the bit of cash we have and the sales, then there's the path to feeling a bit better about things. Could United get 5th place next season? It's not beyond the realms of thinking that United could improve by 30 points because we've chucked so many of them away. So many.
Yeah. And look, I think, on the point about transfers, like, I think, I remember doing a piece and giving it a 6 out of 10 summer at the time, and people were questioning why. And it's like, well, 6 out of 10 is actually fine right now, right? Like, as you say, you just can't afford to have the failures. And if you have people that are just value adding to the squad, if you have people that are all thinking in the same way, that is going to be an immediate uplift. Yeah. It's the tangible uplift that you see. And I have faith. I think the faith will be tested probably by Christmas time, whether that faith is justified.
Well, indeed. I mean, if Ruben still has a 30% win rate by Christmas, he'll be gone, sadly for him. And we are all hoping that is not the case. And they get the squad management right. We win the Europa League. They get the squad management right, in the churn. They're very heavy churn, possibly 11 players going out, I think, with 4 big deals and a few other minor ones, right, coming in. And they can turn it around so they do get another 30 points next season, which I really don't think, or 25 points, I don't think is beyond expectation at all. And we'll be on the boundaries of the Champions League qualification next year, right? That kind of thing. We'll all feel an awful lot better. The costs, as you say, have been ripped out of the club. I mean, 450, it's nearly half the staff have gone, 40% of the staff, right? So we'll be in a much better position financially. We'll see what happens, whether Sir Jim increases his stake over the next year or so. I would be unsurprised if he did. I'm not saying it's a full buyout in the next year, but increasing his stake seems very likely to me. And it could be a very rosy future. A lot of big decisions to make.
And, as you say, execution is critical, and staying true to the plan and having conviction in it.
Yeah.
There's
and so, Jim, if you need a chief strategy officer, I'm perfectly qualified.
It's a shame it's a shame he doesn't need a CFO. He's already got
or a CFO. I mean,
he's already got a very good one.
He's got a very good one, but he seems to be doing the job on a temporary basis. I mean, it's not like he's moved over. He seems like a crisis guy, not the steady state, take it forward guy. So there you go. All right. So Jim's problem's fixed. I know you have to run, Jamie, but I think that's a good state of play where we are. 20 years of the Glazers. Fuck me. It's bad. It's bad stuff. But the future could be better.
It will get better. It has to.
There you go. That's the tagline. Thank you very much, everyone. Drop us a comment on YouTube or Spotify. Let us know what you think and the kind of topics you'd like us to cover in future editions. I guess we're doing these about every 2 weeks-ish. And plenty of stuff to cover, I think, ongoing. It'll be interesting summer with how we structure. Maybe we'll talk a bit transfers in the summer and the the financial structure of some of these when we do the deal for whoever the next Messi is.
Everyone's favorite topic.
All right. Bye now.
Thanks a lot, everyone.